All the way from Virginia, where I'm a forest management extension specialist at Virginia Tech. And let's see, I am a forester by training. I think Ben Snyder, who is one of the students in the audience, can attest to that. We knew each other in New York, where we did some collaborative work at the Frost Valley YMCA, which is very much forestry focused. But I've been at Virginia Tech now for 6 years and started my first year teaching the agroforestry course. And I guess I should note, too, that it was Mike Gold that developed that course in the mid-90s, and I'm happy to report that it's alive and well. We've been at about 90% capacity over the last 2 or 3 years with students, so there's a great deal of interest on the part of students at Virginia Tech with respect to agroforestry. And it's through teaching that course that I've become involved with agroforestry extension and research. And one of our focus areas is forest farming, and that's a topic that I'm going to cover today. As Mike mentioned, the order is a little bit different here, although I think it was great. That was a wonderful presentation by Nicole. I'm very excited to go out to the farm to see all of the different facets of the operation. Initially, I was thinking I was going to hear primarily or specifically about mushrooms, but there's so much going on out there. I think it's going to be a great tour, so I'm looking forward to that. But what I'm going to do is kind of pull back a little bit and provide a broad overview of the scope of forest farming, the potentials and possibilities, some of which were demonstrated in Nicola's presentation. I'm also going to talk about some of the other opportunities related to products that can be farmed in our forested settings. And much of what I cover today is going to parallel some of the content that's included in your manual. So we're going to kind of touch on things related to planning and management, also talk about a little bit of the different types of products that are out there that can be farmed in our forest, and also cover some of the different types of strategies related to forest farming, specifically focusing on the different levels of intensity. And then talk a little bit about some of the advantages, but also cover the challenges. And there are a host of challenges related to forest farming as it's presently existing today in our spectrum of agroforestry practices and on the landscape. And then what I'd like to do after doing that is to kind of pull back a little bit and present an initiative that I'm involved in partnership with the National Agroforestry Center. Mike is also part of this, but what we're trying to do is build a network of forest farmers, university researchers and extensionists, and also agency personnel that are focused on forest farming. It's a very broad field. Pull together a lot of the varieties of different information that those individuals have so that we can kind of synthesize that and channel it in a clearinghouse. And that network is intended to basically build capacity so that we can address the challenges as they currently exist and also take advantages of, or capitalize on some of the advantages related to forest farming. And then lastly, I'll cover a suite of different information venues that I think will be helpful for you as you move forward. And in showcasing that network, also demonstrate the opportunities related to how you could reach out to some of these practitioners to gather information in the future. Okay, so I will define forest farming at the outset of my presentation, and it really is the, as defined technically related to temperate agroforestry, the intentional management and farming of non-timber forest products, NTFPs, also known as specialty forest products, that have some benefits or value in terms of personal use or market sales in an existing or emerging forest underneath the canopy. And that forest has optimal site conditions for the specific product that is being farmed. When I say non-timber forest products, I'm talking about a wide variety of different products that can be managed within our forest, and I'll go over some of those different categories. There are a whole host of them. And those personal use and market sales, there are long-standing traditional benefits associated with NTFPs, but there are also emerging markets. I think Nicola has demonstrated some of the opportunities that have come about in the last 2 or 3 decades related to the expansion of our direct-to-consumer sales through farmers markets. We've seen over a 400% increase in the existence of farmers markets, and there are opportunities to sell non-timber forest products there. Also, in terms of the canopy, thinking about managing the canopy. Okay, it's important, and I think this is coming through in terms of the agroforestry message today, that there is a diversity of different components that need to be considered, incorporated into management strategies. And when you're thinking about forest farming, you're also thinking in terms of the tree crops that are combined with those non-timber forest products that are being managed on that site. and working to achieve some optimal site conditions. That can include thinning to manage for shade. Okay, that's a very important consideration in forest farming, is the level of shade, because some products prefer more shade. Galax being an example. In Virginia, where I'm from, the more shade that it has, actually I should reverse that. It's light that the Galax prefers, probably around 50 to 60%, right? And as it has more light, the leaves become darker and more green, and that's preferred in the floral market. But when it comes to mushrooms, if you drop below 30% in those logs, then in terms of moisture, right, there's no longer a great productive capacity there. So you have to think about a greater shade, and that's why Nicola was emphasizing the pine stands that are so critical to the operation. Also, depending upon the intensity of operation, you want to think about infrastructure, maybe water availability, nutrient availability, so amendments within the soil, and also site and soil characteristics are important as well. So there's some management activities that are tied to forest farming related to trying to expand and develop and create an optimal site for the particular products that are being managed for. And when I say intentional, here we see students from Virginia Tech intentionally planting seeds and rootstock for non-timber forest products that have viable markets in the region where I come from, and those are native medicinals, namely black cohosh, goldenseal, bloodroot, and ginseng. Now, just a little bit of history related to forest farming. More or less for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, we've been intentionally farming in our forests going all the way back to Native Americans, but more recently, a seminal book by J. Russell Smith in 1929 came out and basically made the argument that if we don't begin to consider ways in which we can expand and formalize farming in our forested systems, then we're in trouble, particularly in light of the expanding population and demand for food products and medicinal products as well. This message on the part of J.R. Smith resonated with one of the fathers of forest farming, if you will, Toyohiko Kagawa from Japan, who took that theme, that idea of expanding and formalizing farming in our forested settings to Japan and worked on developing and experimenting with multi-story cropping or forest farming, focusing on tree crops, shrub crops, herbaceous crops, and also incorporating livestock. Since that time, livestock has been kind of pulled out of the forest farming equation, and we're just focusing now on some of those herbaceous and shrub crops that can grow underneath the canopy, and that we have the silvopasture definition related to managing livestock with trees. But Kagawa and Smith did a service in terms of helping us frame this idea of forest farming and the possibilities and the promise related to a formal system in forested settings. Now, those two individuals and others did not precipitate the harvesting of non-timber forest products. For generations, humans have harvested NTFPs for personal use, and over the last couple hundred years or so, as markets have developed around these NTFPs, also for sale. And this is referred to as wildcrafting or wild harvesting. So what we're looking at right now in terms of forest farming as an agroforestry practice is the convergence of this idea of a formal farming system in our forested settings to basically take advantage of those products that have demand, that have had demand historically and have demand today, that traditionally people have harvested in the wild. Now there are four products, or four categories, if you will, for non-timber forest products, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of NTFPs that humans use and consume. It's tough to see here because the screen is kind of shifted, but we have the medicinal NTFPs, we have edible NTFPs, floral and decorative, and specialty and crafts. And I'm going to go into some detail about those particular products. Here we see saw palmetto, okay? One of the most prolifically wild harvested medicinal NTFPs. This is growing in a forest in Georgia, also harvested extensively in Florida. The bottom right, you can see Goldenseal growing in Shenandoah Valley in a oak poplar stand. There are a variety of different raw materials that go into sourcing these medicinal NTFPs. And basically the medicinal NTFP is a product that comes from the forest that has some nutraceutical, holistic, or ethnobotanical value to it that leads to a market or the desire on the part of an individual to consume that. I'm going to move over here just to make sure I don't mess this list up related to our raw materials. But we have wood-based raw materials. An example being harvesting oils from cedar wood that have aromatic and medicinal qualities. Bark-based raw materials. Slippery elm is a very popular bark-based NTFP where I come from. Thousands of pounds are harvested each year. That's ground into a powder made as a throat lozenge. There are oils from buds, so we have bud-based raw materials, leaf-based raw materials, catnip being an example. There's a fairly sizable market associated with that product. Root-based NTFPs with medicinal values, probably ginseng, of course, being one that's most prominently known, I believe, but also Goldenseal is an example. Fruit and flowers, St. John's wort is an example, and lastly, pollen-based raw materials. So a whole host of raw materials feeding into this medicinal NTFP nutraceutical market. Edibles, things we can eat. Mushrooms, we just had the presentation from Nicola. Nuts, fruit, we saw pawpaw. So there, McPherson's seem to be producing pawpaw out on the farm. Also honey and syrup, okay? Not just maple syrup, but also birch syrup is an opportunity. And up at the Cornell's research station in Lake Placid, Mike Farrell is looking into ways to enhance the market and productivity related to black walnut syrup and also butternut. Also fruit, leaves, roots, and plants, and ferns. A great deal of opportunities along those lines. Fiddlehead ferns, very popular across the Midwest and in New England. And then berries for jams, jellies, juices, and wines. So I think not only that, but also I guess flowers too. We potentially could have some cordial that's been produced by Nicola on her farm on Wednesday. Here we see ramps. Okay, the ramp is a very popular NTFP, particularly in my area, but extending all the way up to New York. I'm not sure where the habitat comes this far west, but you can see that across the bowl, and then down the bottom right corner, cooked shiitake mushrooms. RAMP, also known as the wild leek. Floral and decoratives, greenery, I mentioned Galax earlier. Okay, here you see Jim Chamberlain. Many of you know him, I think. Down in the bottom right corner holding Galax leaves. There's, I mentioned earlier, a town in Virginia named after Galax, and we see the fairy wand flower, which grows in Appalachia. There's also tipping, balsam fir being one species that's popular for tipping for wreaths and bows. Berries and stems for decorative purposes, floral arrangements from, for instance, holly, flowers from rhododendron, and also straw and cones. Straw and cones tend to be popular in our intensively managed pine plantations in the deep south, and there are individuals who've invested in balers also gathering cones for decorative purposes. And then lastly, specialty products. Probably all have seen these around, primarily wood-based in terms of carving or other types of crafts. Cypress knees, we have bowls and baskets and bird feeders, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kind of primary four categories related to NTFPs. And in many cases, these these markets are often informal and imperfect. Okay? Informal meaning that they're kind of hidden. Right? I think maybe you've heard about the secretive nature of ginseng harvesting, the poachers. Okay, that carries over to a variety of different NTFPs. And those markets oftentimes are not formalized, so they are hidden and oftentimes difficult to break into. And imperfect, okay? Meaning that they're inconsistent. There's not a great deal of consistency in these markets either. And lastly, the raw materials sometimes are very heavily harvested in the wild. Okay? And so that can lead to great concern related to the sustainability of these non-timber forest products. Okay? These species that source the raw materials that go into these markets, being imperfect, inconsistent, hidden, and also heavily harvested, and moving into some of these high-value markets, is where the argument comes for forest farming. Okay, and pursuing and pushing for the use of that particular agroforestry product is to provide and develop a consistent system that can sustainably source raw material into these existing markets. It's not like the markets don't exist for a lot of these NTFPs. They do. Okay? It's just that most of the raw material comes from wild harvesting. And forest farmers have the opportunity to create sustained yield systems that can tap into those markets and provide those raw materials and take advantage of the opportunities related to the holistic management of their forest. And this is happening right now. Andy Mason, about 6 weeks ago or so, sent an email out to our network basically drawing attention to an article that was published in the Washington Post noting that Maryland has banned wild harvesting of ginseng on state lands. Okay? So this had a lot of wildcrafters up in arms, and rightly so. However, the flip side of the story is that there are 2 forest farmers in Maryland who have been cultivating ginseng. They are now poised to take advantage of greater market share in that state because they have been growing it on their properties. And the state is curtailing some of the harvesting, or all the harvesting on their state land. I just learned this morning that Virginia is actually shortening the wild ginseng harvesting in the state, so on public lands. It's no longer legal to harvest from August 15th to September 1. Now you have to go from September 1 to December 30th. So it used to extend from 15 August to December 31st. They cut it off by 2 weeks. And I think that is related to some extent to the concern of the sustainability of those populations. And it's not just ginseng, but also the ramp. In Canada, there are 2 provinces that have banned wild harvesting of ramps because they have observed overharvesting and are concerned about the sustainability of those populations. This is an article from the New York Times with Jim Chamberlain, who was with the National Agroforestry Center, is still with the Forest Service, but he's with FIA, is cited and covering. Yeah.
Hey, we still claim him. I don't care what the paperwork
says.
says.
He's emeritus. NAC emeritus.
Right,
Jim is still with it, but he's quoted in the articles talking about some of the overharvesting of ramps in the wild. Ramps can bring upwards of $12 to $14 a pound. So if you think about wild harvesting, there's not a lot that goes into it. You find a patch that oftentimes that's exploited and taken to market. But forest farmers have the opportunity to create a sustained yield system. And let's think about what Nicola said in terms of what she's doing. 50 logs and kind of a sustained yield system, meaning they work on 50 logs, they shift over to the next 50, they prepare those for the following harvest. A consistent flow, and that is one of the challenges with NTFP markets, is the inconsistencies. But forest farmers have an opportunity to do that and provide and add to our food source. Now, in terms of methods, there are kind of 3 broad methods or strategies, techniques, if you will, for forest farming, and they vary according to intensity. Decreasing from intensity, woods grown first, most intensive, down to wild simulated, and then lastly to manage wild populations. And I'm going to provide some detail about those different strategies. The woods grown is the most intensive and can be extremely intensive, including machinery, say tilling, bringing out machinery to conduct those types of operations, deep scarification of the soil, materials coming out. Here we see ramp beds being established with landscaping cloth, also with landscaping ties, topsoil being hauled into the woods, and also amendments potentially, if I mentioned earlier, optimal sites and making some site assessments. And there might be, in terms of a woods grown strategy, the need to amend soil to ensure success. And that really is one of the benefits of woods grown is that there's great control. It's almost like gardening in the forest. So you have a lot of infrastructure in place, you have a lot of control, you're doing the things to ensure success. But the challenges there are that this has a lot of labor involved, and also costs associated with trying to control the farming endeavor to that extent. And it also may impact price, because oftentimes NTFPs that bring the highest price are those that have the greatest amount of wild characteristics. And so if you're controlling the process in more of a gardening type approach, that may impact the characteristics of that NTFP and therefore diminish the price to some extent that people are willing to pay. And ginseng is a good example. For your woods grown ginseng, it's about half of what you can get for wild simulated. Now here's another example of woods grown. This is Jim Chamberlain with Dave Carmen in West Virginia, and here you can see he has beds, he has some screens covering his fairy wand crop that he's growing. So he's more of a woods grown approach in terms of cultivating the fairy wand in that setting.
The one before that, what they were preparing a bed, what was that?
Yep, this is for ramps. Ram plantings, yep. And this is just outside of Blacksburg on the Kentland Farm, which is Virginia Tech's University farm. Wild simulated, okay, less intensive than woods grown. This can entail, say it's limited, no machinery really, maybe limited materials to no materials other than a shovel or even just your hands. But basically pulling back leaves, simple scarification of the soil, maybe some mounding and that type of thing, and then planting seeds into the ground. Some of the benefits related to wild simulated is that it's less expensive, okay, there's less labor, and the price or the costs are not as high as they are in a woods grown setting. But the challenges are that you have less control over the production or the cultivation. And so the success rates oftentimes are much lower in wild simulated, but the payoff can be pretty significant in terms of the characteristic of the product if in fact that wild characteristic is part of the market demand. We see another, this is an example of wild simulated. If we go back, we see beds, topsoil, ties, fabric, screens. Here we see just pulling back the leaves, dropping seeds in, or rhizomes, and covering that back up and kind of walking away. Here you see basically all you have are flags to kind of demarcate where you have your rows planted in the wooded setting. Now, also behind you can see some fencing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of challenges associated with some of these valuable NTFPs, but it's a good snapshot of wild simulated. And then lastly, manage wild populations. And so in terms of that, this approach, it's, if you encounter a wild stand, basically the idea here is rather than exploit that stand and harvest it all, is to tend the stand, to implement some farming practices to ensure sustainability and longevity of production over time. And here we see some discussion related to how a wild ramp stand in New York could be managed over time to sustainably yield that ramp product as opposed to just going in and taking it all at once and potentially even expand production in that area as well. Now, forest management, I mentioned earlier, is a key consideration. I mean, forest farming is part of a holistic forest management strategy, but in terms of timber products, which oftentimes drive some of the larger or more prominent objectives related to forest land, it's important to keep in mind how the objectives related to farming non-timber forest products and those related to managing timber over the long term can be merged. Oftentimes, forest farmers will identify areas in their stands that are not operable, okay, but have good site characteristics for forest farming, so they know that there's not going to be any competition between, say, some of the timber management and the high impact activity that may occur there. And now there's this area where we never thought we could really do much with, that we in fact have an opportunity to kind of manage. But also thinking in terms of shade, okay, and also thinking in terms of the cycle of time related to timber. If in fact you have to merge forest farming into those areas, you want to think about those different components and how they might fit together in this puzzle over time related to managing your timber crop and also managing your NTFP crop. And that's where planning comes in really. Markets, important, critical before you step off in any farming endeavor, and I think it was emphasized by Nicole and others today. You know, identifying those markets and identifying which products are saleable in those areas, and I think that's good. Now, if you're just managing small plots for personal consumption, that's another thing. But if you're going to step off big and maybe incrementally grow, like Nicole mentioned, or at least that's one of your objectives, then it would be important to understand the markets and how you can sell your products. I think we had a good example earlier. Time as well. Okay, so these aren't necessarily annual crops. Okay, oftentimes these non-timber forest products take multiple years to grow enough biomass that can then be harvested and sold in the market. So you want to think about time. How are you going to establish? Okay, what types of approaches are you going to use? Do you have the resources and the time and the energy to invest in woods grown, which, as I demonstrated earlier, is more like forest gardening? Or would you like to do something more extensive? Try that first, see what happens, what type of germination you get, what types of success rates you get, and then go from there. Also think in terms of establishment, looking for indicator species, and one of the best obviously would be that particular plant or shrub that you're interested in growing in that setting. Identify that, and that would depict then a good site for potentially growing those NTFPs. But also thinking about how you might manipulate that site too to get the right characteristics. And there are a whole host of NTFPs, so you need to be careful and look into the characteristics of each plant and what it would need in terms of growing, and do your best to establish a site that could potentially have some success. Then lastly, management over time. Okay, how are you going to tend that crop? How are you going to protect that crop? I mentioned that as well. And then lastly, operations. Okay, you have to get in there and gather those materials and work on then selling them into market or pulling them back for personal consumption. So those are all key considerations. Some of the advantages: forest health and composition, talking about diverse forests here. Expanding, improving composition of species in forests is an important objective from an environmental standpoint. Diversifying income opportunities. Right, so if your timber rotation is 15 or 20 years, right, within that period of time, you perhaps have an opportunity to cultivate a ginseng crop, or you can use that area for mushroom cultivation. You could use that area to grow flowers, berries in those areas. So within that window, you have an opportunity there within that same spot to diversify your income opportunities. And profitability and sustainability is important. I noted that earlier. That's one of the key arguments related to forest farming. And there's a range of operation sizes. You can expand to something as large as what the Ozark Forest products are pursuing, or you can have something quite small. Some of the budgets that have been put together by Janine Davis in North Carolina State demonstrate that, you know, as a little half an acre over the course of, say, 6 to 7 years, you could realize thousands of dollars of profit related to Goldenseal cultivation, same with ginseng, and hundreds of dollars over the course of 3 years related to ramps. And one of the advantages is there's large landowner interest. When we look at our surveys related to landowners, NTFPs, forest farming tends to be one of the most popular agroforestry practices. That's also a challenge because we have a lot of people to potentially reach. There's this idea of market saturation. You know, are they willing to go through with it? Oftentimes some of our forest landowners are not those that are willing to get involved in intensive farming. There's also some issues related to identity. Steve Gabriel up in New York has talked a little bit about this, defining forest farming. Because the breadth of NTFPs are so broad, oftentimes there's some confusion about exactly what constitutes a viable product for forest farming. Poaching is an issue. Science too, limited production information, and that is a real challenge right now. You know, when I cover kind of the management strategies and the approaches to forest farming, we see that they're kind of general. It's like, okay, plant seeds, or, you know, come in and put in the bed and see what happens. We have limited information in terms of how to achieve some of the sustained yield outcomes that are part of the definition. People are working on that right now, but we still have some way to go. And I mentioned some of the market volatility earlier. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, that provides kind of an overview of where we're at with forest farming right now. But we are working to develop a network through the e-extension system. I have the website listed down here. E-extension is a USDA program that is working online to kind of synthesize and develop clearinghouse for information related to different issues that are important to extension. And forest farming has a place at the table right now. We have over 50 members nationwide. that have some form of experience with forest farming that are helping to kind of synthesize and as I said, collect information on this site where you could go and find out some of the particulars related to forest farming of specific crops. And this is one of our newsletters. Just quickly to showcase some of our members so you have an idea of who's involved. Like I mentioned, we have forest farmers that are participating. This is Dave Carmen, who farms a variety of different native medicinals in the Princeton, West Virginia area. Here you see him on his farm. And this is some areas where he's producing fairy wand. That root renders $60 a pound on the market. And so he is about 3 acres or so that he's farming right now with probably about 30 or so medicinal species. His big take-home species or his money makers are fairy wand and Goldenseal. He's also farming ginseng and bloodroot. Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel, I mentioned Steve earlier, talking a little bit about the identity issue and working to better define forest farming. Both of them have a really fantastic site. They're out of Cornell, Farming the Woods. I'd recommend going to take a look at this. They're also working on a book right now to document the practices of forest farmers across the country to demonstrate and at least better elucidate possibilities related to pursuing forest farming, and also to help define the practice a little bit better. But they're part of this, and we've also developed a video series through our e-extension site focusing on the aspects related to shiitake mushroom production and also ramp production. So those are on YouTube now and available through the eextension.org forest farming page. And then lastly, one of our other members, Janine Davis. And I should note that Janine and Jim and I collaborated on writing the chapter for the training manual. Janine has a wealth of information through her ncherb.org site related to primarily medicinal species and their cultivation. She's a horticulturist at North Carolina State, so I'd also recommend visiting her website. And then lastly, a whole host of different partners that have resources related to forest farming, the National Agroforestry Center, University of Missouri here, Institute for Cultural Ecology, that's out in Washington, focused primarily on NTFPs, but they have a wonderful website that they've put together with pictures and information about these products. The Missouri Alternative Center could be useful, the Association for Temperate Agroforestry, National Sustainable Ag Information Service, non-timber forest products at Virginia Tech is one that Jim Chamberlain coordinates, and then of course the extension site that I mentioned. So there's a lot of information out there. We still have a long way to go in terms of improving what we know about cultivation and production, but the markets exist for a lot of these products, and that's good news for potential forest farmers. It's just a matter of moving forward with the right strategies to tap into those. And I think we've got some good examples on our extension site and some that we've seen today. Any questions? Yes.
The question I had is, have you done any work with connecting landowners with potential producers? Because there may be people that are interested in forest farming that don't have.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I noted earlier there's this great deal of landowner interest, but these are forest landowners, which are not necessarily like your conventional farmer. You know, so the extensive idea is something that, you know, they might buy into, but in terms of the intensive management, I don't know of any examples. I do know of networking that's occurred in New York around shiitake mushrooms, and Ken and Steve have been a part of that. And I don't know the extent to which they're employing or pulling people in to do that if they're part of the network. But I think that's a really good point. That's a possibility that I'm not aware of.
I've heard of that ramps. People actually, I guess,
To cultivate ramps. Yeah,
but I
thereabouts?
don't think that's in Pennsylvania, but
Okay.
I don't know that it's a formalized
Yeah.
concept.
Yeah, I'd be interested in talking to them. Yes, Andy? Okay, yeah.
Just kind of mention on the flip end of that, there's also like a growing number of like orchardists who are interested in kind of maybe not thinking about woodland management, but can you think of your fruit tree almost as a canopy layer and then sort of designing, like mimicking forest systems, but not necessarily regard to like farming in the forest, but like the forest. I think there's a lot of potential for that to be integrated in, and new networks that have been helpful on our side. Michael Phillips' work, Holistic Orchard Management, they've been really great. David Jackie out of the Forest Garden. So I'm just thinking of like there's a lot of like, I think, talking parallel tracks here and then ways that we can cross over and meet both farm side and then the forestry side.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard discussion related to large-scale windbreaks too, is providing adequate conditions, optimal sites for potentially farming in those areas, and also some of the riparian buffers, the multifunctional, multi-purpose, and multi-species buffers, and opportunities underneath those canopies to farm. So.
It's really working so far on our farm. We're not necessarily like growing fruit trees and not in forest, but we're mimicking forest edge and transitioning that way, and it's been kind of a really fun discovery, just figuring out, oh, we should have done that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the existing stand, or the kind of emerging forests in those areas, but then there's these planted opportunities, maybe on a smaller scale. But yeah, I think anywhere where you have the shading that is useful for the growth and cultivation of these plants, then I think you have opportunities. Yeah, Andy.
Well, I was just curious, John, I guess off in the future, but the sustainability, this wild harvesting that we all know is going on and these populations are being depleted, might some kind of certification of forest farming hold promise for helping and maybe increasing the market share and encouraging forest farming rather than as it is today?
Yeah, I know that there's a paper, Mike Jacobson was part of it, that argued that our forest certification systems need to better articulate opportunities related to forest farming as part of that certifying body and its program. And so I think there's opportunities to articulate forest farming within the forest certification stream. I would also think that there could be benefits related to certifying forest farms. I know that the organic side can be branded on some of the products, and Nicola mentioned that she was, and she's since transitioned out of that. There's another farmer who has that brand and is pursuing those practices and wants to find market share accordingly. I think that, right now we still want to work on some of the sustained yield and the production opportunities, but hand in hand with that needs to be kind of formalization of management in that kind of forest farming setting. And I think that some kind of certification or other type of formal branding could go a long way in terms of helping to increase market access and share and make forest farming more attractive. Yes.
In regards to poaching, I know a guy I work with, he lives over in western Iowa. He had between 200 to 500 pounds of his ginseng stolen from him. He's fighting with the insurance company right now. What are their options for if they do have these sites? And you said that the guy had the fence and everything. Is there some sort of crop insurance or is it liability?
I'm not going to be able to answer the question about crop insurance. I don't know. It's just been recently that some of the agroforestry practices in Maine have made their way into some of the kind of formal documents associated with our agencies. Through the government and some of the potential insurance programs and their partnerships with some of the private side entities, they're in the future, maybe. I'm not aware of that right now. And maybe it's a possibility, but I just can't answer that question. I don't know if anyone else in the room has a better understanding of the lay of the land.
I thought that in Wisconsin, I know.
Yeah. I mean, ginseng is a little bit of an anomaly because it does bring such a high value, but that's one reason why people get into it. And those that are large scale have extensive security systems. And so, if you're going to go to that scale, oftentimes investment is warranted. For instance, there's a farmer in North Carolina who has video surveillance, electric fencing, concertina wire, dogs, it's firearms too. I mean, it's fortunately, this is one thing, and I mentioned that earlier, poaching, it can be dangerous. In Ohio a few years ago, there was a poacher that was shot and killed.
And he thought he was fine because he made the comment to me, who's going to know what ginseng is in Iowa or Nebraska?
Yeah. I've heard stories. I don't know how much of them are rural legend or rural myth, but the last second you're preparing to harvest, you're like, okay, we're there. We're 7-8 years. The leaves are looking great. We pulled a few, the crop's looking good, and then all of a sudden it's disappeared.
And I've seen the pictures and it looks like, almost like they took a knife or something and just dug everything out.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is an issue, without doubt. But there are other NTFPs that don't command such a high price, that don't have this kind of black market or dark side to them, that can source food and medicinal products and so on. So don't just look at ginseng as the beacon, but it's true. It is an issue related to some. Yeah, Bruce.
John, I see that Dave Carmen had a SARE grant, and it looked like an on-farm project, and there's a nice little final report summary of his project. I think that's just another area that we need to think about, is working with landowners as opportunities to do on-farm, in-forest type research to gather more information that we're lacking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Bruce. It was kind of in my mind when I was putting this together. I didn't have a chance to share it, but traditional ecological knowledge associated with
Right.
cultivation of these products, and relying on what's been passed down through generations, but also what landowners can explore. And Dave Carmen is a good example. He did have a SARE grant, and he has some numbers related to some of the production of his higher value NTFPs that can benefit all of us in terms of advancing the practice. So, yeah, it's not just the experts or the researchers, but also going out to the landowners that have a good, strong understanding.
One or two more.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Was that the profitability sheets you mentioned about Goldenseal? Was that from the farm?
No, that's from Janine Davis.
Okay.
And there is a book by Persons and Davis, I think it's published in 2005, which is Cultivating Ginseng and Goldenseal, and there are some budgets in there. So you can take a look at those. They have some good numbers. Fairly sizable book, and Persons, Scott Persons is a big successful ginseng and Goldenseal grower. Just a large wealth of knowledge.
My thought is if you're going to have concertina wire as guns, you might as well just grow something illegal.
Colorado, potentially, Washington State scenes these days. Yeah.
I didn't say that.
Legal in parts, I suppose.
Yeah, it's legal in parts. All right, so we've got about a 10-minute break, so enjoy it, and then we're going to hear the view from inside the Beltway.